change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Exodus. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
And so being consecrated here means you have to be mentally and physically set apart. So you're not to be distracted with your daily activities. And so the men, they're all instructed to stay apart from your normal intimacy that you'd have with your wives for the next 3 days in preparing to meet with God. And this instruction for men not to be intimate with their wives is in no way saying that the act of intimacy in marriage is defiling. This is more like fasting. This is more like doing this to prepare your heart. And so they all do this. And now it's the third day, and there's all this thundering and lightning, and then they hear the trumpet from heaven, and that trumpet is the signal to come to the mountain, that the invitation is now open, and these people are scared. And it says here that they're trembling, and that's because this trumpet is very loud. And so Moses, he actually has to go out there and take them from the camp and brings them to the foot of the mountain to meet God. And then God, he descends on the mountain in fire, and then there's this thick smoke like a furnace. And that trumpet just keeps getting louder and louder and louder. And now the earth is quaking. Then Moses, he speaks in front of the people, and then they hear God answer Moses back. So now they're hearing the voice of God. And you kind of have to give Israel credit here, because you see that fire and you see that smoke and you see that lightning and thunder, and you got the earth quaking and that increasing blast of the trumpet coming down from heaven. Because all this would make me want to do is just to run. And these people, they've already seen the power of God displayed on the Egyptians in an unfavorable way. And so this is really powerful, but it's not very enticing. It's not what I would picture in my mind of how wonderful it would be to go and meet God. Because that trumpet, it's not playing some kind of smooth jazz, and this is not really a picture of paradise that you would associate God. Maybe you would say there'd be a rainbow there, or maybe some kind of beautiful sunrise, or maybe you see a couple dolphins flying through the air or something like that. So this doesn't send the message of peace with God. But the reality that they're having here is that God is very powerful, and he's to be respected, and he's to be feared, and he's to be reverenced. And this won't be anything they will ever forget. In fact, you would think they could never forget it, but they will. And so now God, he's coming down on the mountain with fire, and God calls Moses up. And so now Moses is going up to the mountain, and the earth is trembling, and he's walking into that smoke. And you have to see here that Moses, he also fears God, but he's not afraid. And that's because Moses knows God, and he knows of his love, and he knows of his kindness. And so he fears God, but he's not afraid of God. And the first thing that God says to Moses when he gets to the top of that mountain is, go back down. You kind of got to feel sorry for that guy. But God, he tells Moses to warn those people, lest they break through and gaze at the Lord, and many of them perish. And so what I'm imagining here is that some of those people, they were going to follow Moses up that mountain. And it kind of sounds to me like maybe some of the priests were considering going up there. Because now God gives the priest a special warning for them to make sure they're consecrated, and for them not to think that they don't have to be, so that the Lord won't break out against them if they get too near. And then Moses, he reminds the Lord of his warning about the boundary set. And it's not like the Lord didn't remember. But the Lord makes it clear that the people, including the priests, they can't come up. So this is not an open invitation, but only Moses and Aaron were invited to come up. And so Moses, he goes back down to give the people this warning. So up and down and up and down. That's what Moses' life was until we get to chapter 20. And this is where God gives Israel the Ten Commandments. All right. So now, if you've seen that movie with Charlton Heston, The Ten Commandments, and you saw that fireball in animation, and it was shooting out, flying through the air, and writing each of these 10 commandments on those tablets of stone, just to let you know, and this is a little side fact, that word for lightning here, where it talks about lightning flashes in our passage, that is an unusual Hebrew word. And it could be translated fireballs, or it could be translated torches. In fact, it's actually the same word that's used in Genesis 15 when God made that covenant with Abraham, where it talks about the burning torch that passed through those animal pieces. That's the same word here. But that's not how this happened here. There were no fireballs writing on the stone tablets. The way that the children of Israel received the law was by spoken commandments. These 2 million people, they were actually gathered at the base of the mountain, and they actually heard these commands from God in God's own voice. They never read them first on tablets of stone. It's only later when Moses goes up to the mountain to get these tablets and to bring these writings back down to them. And although the law is given to Israel here, these 10 commandments, they were never given to Israel for their salvation. These people were already saved. These people were already God's covenant people. They had already been redeemed by God, and that's all of them. And all of them have been baptized in the sea. So by Israel obeying these 10 commandments, it doesn't make them God's people. They are already God's people. But Israel's occupation to the promised land is dependent, and they're tied to their obedience to obeying these laws from God. This is the same as the way it is for us in our relationship with God. Our relationship with God is not based on obeying the 10 commandments or any laws. Although we should try, or at least to obey the Spirit, because these laws, they were good. But we too are a redeemed people. But our redemption is through Jesus Christ, where God made a covenant with us through his blood, through the blood of his Son. So the law here, the 10 commandments, they don't make you clean. What they do, it's more like looking into a mirror. It just reflects the areas where you're dirty. And all of these 10 commandments are all repeated in the New Testament, except for the commandment for keeping the Sabbath. And it's just like Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And you'll find that all these 10 commandments are summed up in Jesus' dialogue with a lawyer in Matthew 22:35, where the lawyer asks Jesus, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment?" And Jesus replies, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets." And that's exactly how these 10 commandments are broken up, with the first 4 commandments dealing with man's relationship with God and loving God with all your heart. And then the last 6 commandments dealing with man's relationship with man, which is the loving your neighbor as yourself. And where we say man here, this also means women and children too. You know this. You have to remember here, this is not the 10 suggestions, and this is not the 10 opinions. These are commandments. So these are the things that God verbally commanded Israel. But before he commands anything, he reminds them of who he is. And he says that he delivered them from the slavery of Egypt. Okay, so here we go. The first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. This is not saying that they can have other gods behind him. It's not like they can have a number two God or a number three God. But Jehovah, he has to be our number one. But before me, it literally means to my face or in my presence. So it can mean that there can be no gods in opposition to him, which is basically just saying no other gods. And if the Jews, if they worshiped another god, what they would be doing is declaring war with Jehovah, and they would incur his wrath. But you'll see that the Jews, they will end up worshiping other gods, and it did get them kicked out of the land, but they never ever stopped totally worshiping Jehovah. They just worshiped the other gods alongside with him. So they did exactly what God said not to do. And then the commandment number 2, you shall not make yourself a carved image. And then it says anything in heaven or on earth, beneath the earth. And so this includes anything and everything. But this is not prohibiting art or sculpture or even engravings, because there was art in the tabernacle and in the temple. They had statues of angels and bulls and pomegranates and almond trees. They had all sorts of things. But you're not to bow down before them as if they represented God. They were just for decoration. It was just art. And I would say this is the same for statues of Jesus or bowing down in front of paintings of Jesus. They're just art. They're not to be worshiped. You don't serve them. And with this command, he says he's a jealous God. And he's not saying that he's jealous of these other gods, because he knows that these other gods are not real, that they're only figments of other people's imaginations. But what God is saying is that he's jealous over his relationship with us. Like you would be protective over your relationship with your husband or with your wife or with your kids, and how you wouldn't want anyone to take your place with them. And you can see this kind of jealousy with parents over their kids. When a couple gets divorced and there's a new step-parent introduced into the family, nobody wants to be replaced. And it's never okay with the estranged parent. And then God tells them that he's a jealous God. And then he talks about God visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon their children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Well, this is not talking about ancestral sin, where you're being punished for the sins of your parents. Because the important words here are for those who hate me. And those words, hate me, actually means the bent. And so that means that these children will have the same bent of the sins of their parents. And as you have to remember, what they're talking about here is they're talking about idolatry, because their children are being taught idolatry. So if the parents have a bent toward idolatry, the children will have a bent toward it too. And it says this will be for 3 to 4 generations. But then you have to compare that to what he says about those who love God, that mercy will be shown to thousands of generations. So God is so much more rich in mercy to anyone who loves him. And he's also merciful to their children. All right, now with the 2nd commandment, you'll find that the Roman Catholics, they have left this out of the 10 commandments completely. They did it as if the 2nd commandment, it didn't exist. And this was to protect their making of images, so they don't even mention it. But so that they can have 10 commandments, what they do is they divide the 10th commandment into 2 commandments. And so instead of the 10th commandment saying, you shall not covet, they have for number 9, you shall not covet a man's wife. And then for number 10, you shall not covet a man's goods. And so they kind of play a little bit fast and loose with the scriptures here. And then we get to number 3, where it says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And it says that the Lord won't hold those people guiltless, those who take his name in vain. And you hear people do that all the time, especially with the name of Jesus. But this would also include those people who profit off the name of God by their lies and their manipulations. They're also considered taking God's name in vain, or people making careless oaths or even those bad habits like the OMG and stuff like that. And then we come to commandment number 4. And it says, remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy. And again, this is the only commandment that is not reinforced in the New Testament, where we as a church, we celebrate the first day. We don't celebrate the seventh day. The first day of the week, we do it the same way as the early church did, not the seventh day like the Jews. And it's not because we just randomly just throw away this commandment. But see, this commandment is in the law, and all of the law was fulfilled through Jesus Christ, where all of the law is actually completed in him. And if you remember, Sabbath means rest, or it means cease from work. And it had already been established for Israel. But now here, it's going to be part of their written law. And there is never any evidence anywhere in the scriptures that God had ever given the Sabbath to any Gentile nation. But here, this day is to be set apart for Israel's devotion to God, because this was supposed to be a witness to their pagan neighbors, to be able to have this day off and to not go to work and to be able to spend it with your family. And this was given to man and given to Israel as a gift. And it wasn't just for you to have the day off. It was for everyone in your family and even your servants and even your farm animals. Where all the other nations, the seventh day was just another day. But with the Jews and even them taking this rest, all the nations will see that God will still bless them abundantly, because it's God who blessed them. It wasn't their work. It's just like God did with the manna, where he provided for them for the Sabbath. And here, where God intended the Sabbath to be a blessing, the Jews eventually turned it into a burden, and it became what you can't do on the Sabbath. And they treated the Sabbath as if it was a punishment. But to keep the Sabbath holy meant to keep it separate or separated. And that's exactly what the word holy means. It just means separate. And if you think that you need to keep this command and you want to keep the Sabbath, there's something you kind of got to look at and realize here, that the rest of this command also says that you need to work for 6 days. It's not a 5-day work week. It's a 6-day work week with 1 day off. That ends this section regarding for man's relationship with God. And so now with the 5th commandment, we look at the laws of man's relationship to man. And so you have number 5, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land the Lord your God is giving you. And so you see here that there is a tie of obedience to dwelling in the land of Canaan, that you need to honor your parents. And you'll see these same commands of honoring your parents. You'll find them in Ephesians 6. You also find it in Colossians. And honoring your parents isn't about them being right or wrong. It's not even about them deserving it, because not all parents do deserve it. But the thing is that God commands it. And then you have number 6, the commandment, number 6, you shall not murder. And most of us have heard this commandment as thou shalt not kill. But the proper translation of this is murder, and it's talking about premeditated murder. So this doesn't include acts of war, because we're going to see that God will send Israel into battle. And the Jews, they were always allowed to defend themselves. And this doesn't include capital punishment, where the death penalty is allowed to be carried out by civil government. And this is not talking about any accidental deaths like manslaughter. And we'll see that manslaughter is going to be covered later in other areas of the law. And then with this very next commandment, number 7, you shall not commit adultery. Well, the penalty for committing adultery back then was stoning to death. So you can see, if that last commandment meant you should never kill, we would have a real big contradiction here. But this commandment of not committing adultery means you're to honor marriage. And with murder and with adultery, there was no sacrifice that could be made for those sins. There was no remedy found in the law for committing adultery or for committing murder. With those sins, it was always the death penalty, and it was the death penalty by stoning. But that doesn't mean God can't forgive those sins. It's just saying that forgiveness for those sins cannot be found in the law. And then commandment number 8 is you shall not steal. And so that tells us that God, he honors personal property. So taking things that aren't yours are always wrong. And then you have number 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And if you did and you got caught, you could end up getting stoned to death. Because if you lie against your neighbor and you become a false witness and you told those lies in a court and it was a capital crime, Moses is going to require those who witness those crimes against the neighbor to be their executioner. They're the first ones to have to throw a stone. And so if you bear false witness against your neighbor, you would have to murder your neighbor to cover up your lie. But this commandment also includes things like calling your neighbor names that aren't true. And then we get to number 10, you shall not covet. And we already talked about how the Roman Catholic divides this into 2 commandments. But this do not covet includes your neighbor's wife, his male and female servants. Well, to our society, that might mean to coveting their employees or any of their animals. So coveting their donkey would be like coveting somebody's car or anything of your neighbors. You can't covet their Beanie Baby collection, the ones that you always wanted. And the problem with this commandment is that this is not an outward sin. This coveting is an inward sin of the heart. It's to desire something that doesn't belong to you. And if you could obey all the other commandments, this is the one that would get you. This is the one where everybody becomes guilty because everybody wants something. And this is the one where the Apostle Paul found himself guilty. And he talks about this in the book of Romans. And this word covet in Hebrew is the word hamad. And we translate it as desire. But it literally means to pant over. All right, so now we have these 2 million Israelites. We just heard God speak to them. And being in God's presence, it didn't really draw them closer to him. In fact, we see them standing at the bottom of the mountain, standing afar off, which means they're as far as they can go. And they're all terrified. And they never want to hear God's voice again. And they say that to Moses. And they ask Moses, hey, be our mediator. Because when we hear God, we feel like we're going to die. And the people say, from now on, you tell us what God says, and we'll do it. But Moses, he tries to assure them that they don't need to live in fear, that this is just a test for them and how God wanted to impress them, that he is to be feared, because this is to help them not to sin and to keep these 10 commandments. And in some ways, this is no different to us, where we too need a mediator. And that's because God has never changed at all. He is still holy and he is still to be feared. But Jesus Christ, he became our mediator and he made peace with us through his own blood, where now God has no wrath for us. And when you get to Hebrews, it'll say that we can come boldly before the throne of God without fear. And that's because there is no wrath against us anymore. And Moses, he didn't have the same fear that the people had. And the reason he didn't have it is because he has a relationship with God that the people didn't have.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel Waterford and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,